The Clockmaker's Garden. Chapter 1. The Garden of Lost Minutes. Walter Bramble had always believed that Thursdays arrived with slightly damp shoes. Not literally, of course. Thursdays did not have feet, as far as Walter knew, although he had once known a Tuesday that behaved as if it owned a pair of boots. But Thursday evenings had a particular feeling about them, half tired, half expectant, and often carrying the faint smell of rain on stone. This Thursday was no exception. The rain had finished just before supper, leaving the pavements silver and the garden leaves shining as though someone had gone round polishing them with a cloth. Walter stood at his kitchen window, one hand around a mug of tea, watching a blackbird hop across the lawn with the grave concentration of a solicitor reading a disappointing will. "Busy, are we?" Walter said. The blackbird stabbed at the grass. "Ah, worm business. Serious, that is." The bird ignored him. Walter took no offence. Birds, he felt, had their own correspondence to attend to. His little Victorian house was settling into its evening noises. A pipe clicked somewhere behind the wall. The stairs gave a sigh, though nobody was on them. In the hallway, the grandfather clock ticked with the calm importance of a thing that had been telling the time since before anyone had thought to ask it nicely. Walter rather liked clocks, not new ones especially. New clocks told you the time as if they were giving evidence. Precise, efficient, slightly smug. Old clocks were different. Old clocks told the time as though they remembered it. After washing his mug and placing it carefully beside the sink, Walter fetched his coat from the peg in the hall. Then, as he always did before leaving the house, he picked up the small leather notebook from the table near the door. The notebook had once belonged to his wife. She had been a librarian, and she had written in it with the neat, sloping hand of someone who believed words deserved to sit properly. The first pages were filled with her favourite quotations, copied from novels, poems, essays, and one rather severe book about mosses. Walter had never written over those pages. He continued after them. There were sketches now, notes, little observations from walks, a drawing of a very judgmental pigeon, a list of biscuits ranked according to structural integrity, 3 separate attempts to describe the exact colour of fog. The notebook was no longer just hers, nor was it entirely his. It had become, in Walter's mind, a quiet conversation that had not quite ended. He slipped it into his coat pocket, then paused. A page edge had worked loose near the middle. "That's not where you usually are," he murmured. He opened the notebook. On the page, in his wife's handwriting, was a quotation he did not remember seeing before. "Time is not a road we walk. It is a garden we misplace ourselves in." Walter read it twice, then once more, because some sentences deserved a third look. "Well now," he said softly, "isn't that a thought sideways?" The house ticked around him. The clock in the hall gave a small wooden click. Walter closed the notebook and held it for a moment against his chest. Then he put on his scarf, locked the front door, and stepped out into the blue hush of evening. The walk to the library took 5 minutes if Walter walked briskly, 6 if he stopped to inspect anything, and 7 if Mrs. Pember's cat was on the wall and required formal greeting. Tonight the cat was present, sitting very straight with its tail wrapped around its paws, looking like a small magistrate in fur. "Evening?" Walter said. The cat blinked. "Fair judgment. Carry on." The town was quiet. Windows glowed in neat rectangles. A bicycle leaned against a lamp-post. Rainwater gathered in the cracks between paving stones, reflecting pieces of sky and chimney pots. Walter liked that about puddles. They gave the world another chance to arrange itself. Soon the library appeared at the end of the street. It was an old building of red brick and tall windows, with stone lintels, and a wooden door that complained politely whenever anyone opened it. Above the entrance, carved letters announced the building's purpose with Victorian certainty. Public library. No fuss, no flourish, just the thing itself. Walter stepped inside. The warmth met him first, then the smell. Old paper, polish, dust, binding glue, wool coats, and something faintly floral that might have been a cleaning spray, or might have been the ghost of a summer long retired. Mrs. Finch sat behind the desk with a stack of returned books at her elbow. "Evening, Walter." "Evening, Mrs. Finch. Anything particular today?" Walter considered this. "I never know until it's found me." Mrs. Finch nodded as if this were a perfectly workable library system. Walter moved between the shelves. He never hurried in the library. Hurrying among books seemed rude, rather like rushing through a room where everyone was trying to remember something important. He passed travel writing, then local history, then gardening, where a large green book on compost leaned with an air of permanent exhaustion. At the far end of the library was a narrow section that Walter rarely visited. Not because he disliked it, but because it seemed to avoid notice. It stood behind a square pillar near a tall window where the shelves were slightly darker and the carpet softer with age. Walter stopped. On the upper shelf, half hidden behind a row of faded volumes, was a book he had never seen before. It was bound in green cloth. Not bright green, not garden centre green. An old weathered green, like moss on stone or the shadowed underside of leaves. There was no title on the spine, no author, no library label. Walter reached up carefully and eased it free. Dust lifted into the air. "Sorry," he whispered, though he was not entirely sure whether he was apologizing to the book or the dust. The book was heavier than it looked. Its cover felt warm beneath his fingers, although the library itself was not unusually warm. The cloth was patterned faintly with shapes that might have been vines, or perhaps clock hands, depending on how the light caught them. Walter carried it to the nearest table and sat down. The library around him seemed to grow quieter, not silent. Libraries were never silent, but the ordinary sounds, the rustle of pages, the creak of a chair, Mrs. Finch's rubber stamp, seemed to move a little farther away. Walter opened the book. The first page was blank, so was the second. The third held a drawing, a garden. Not a tidy garden. Not one of those disciplined gardens where every shrub stood to attention and no weed dared breathe. This was a deep, moonlit garden with winding paths, leaning trees, high glass houses, fountains, archways, and flower beds shaped like spirals. But the flowers were strange. Some had faces like small clock dials. Some grew with silver hands instead of stems. Some were folded shut around tiny, glowing numerals. In the corner of the page was a sketch of a greenhouse with a round clock above its door. Beneath it, in thin ink, were the words, "The Clockmaker's Garden." Walter's fingers rested on the page. A scent rose from it. Not paper, not ink. Wet leaves, brass, lavender, cold starlight, if such a thing could be smelled. "Well," Walter said quietly, "that's unusual forward." The clock in the library struck 8. At least Walter thought it did. But the first chime came too soon after the last. Then another. Then none. Then 3. together. Mrs. Finch looked up from her desk, or perhaps she did not. The room blurred at the edges. The words on the page shimmered. The drawn garden deepened. Shadows beneath the trees became true shadows. The path curled away into distance. Walter felt a soft pull, not at his coat or his hands, but somewhere behind his ribs. "Oh," he said, "here we are going again, are we?" The table vanished. The library vanished. The chair beneath him vanished last, which Walter felt was careless. For a moment he was falling through the smell of old paper and rain. Then his feet landed on a stone path. He steadied himself with a small, dignified wobble. Before him stretched the garden from the book. It was night, a deep blue night, rich and clear, with stars scattered overhead like sugar knocked from a careless spoon. Lanterns glowed along the paths. Flowers grew in great soft banks of purple, blue, gold, and white. Some opened as he watched, their petals unfolding around tiny, ticking faces. To Walter's right stood a bed of daisies. Their white petals shivered, and each flower gave a little click, 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 not together, never together, some too fast, some too slow. A border of roses climbed a low wall, each bloom made of velvet petals and fine brass teeth. Their centers turned gently like gears. Further ahead, beyond the winding path, a great glass house glowed with amber light. Above its door hung a clock. Its hands spun backwards. Walter removed his spectacles, polished them on his scarf, and put them back on. The clock continued spinning backwards. Better not from polishing, then. A soft wind moved through the garden. It carried whispering, not voices exactly, more like pages turning very far away. Walter put a hand into his pocket and felt the notebook there. That reassured him. Then he saw the minutes. They drifted across the path like small moths. Pale silvery things, each shaped like a tiny scrap of paper. They fluttered around the flowers, settled on leaves, rose again, and disappeared into the dark. One landed on Walter's sleeve. He looked closely. On it was written, "The minute before laughter." Another settled near his shoe. "The minute after rain stops." A third hovered in front of his face. "The minute you remember someone's voice." Walter became very still. The little minute trembled in the air, then drifted away. "Careful things," he whispered. From somewhere ahead came a clatter, a crash, a burst of muttered annoyance. Then a man's voice said, "No, no, no, that was Tuesday's hour. Tuesday's hour does not belong in the West Fountain. Entirely wrong. Professionally disastrous." Walter followed the sound. Around a bend in the path he found a small clearing. In the center stood a workbench beneath a crooked tree. The tree's leaves were shaped like clock hands, and they turned slowly in the wind. The bench was covered with gears, springs, tiny screwdrivers, glass domes, seed packets, brass keys, and 3 teacups, none of which contained tea. A man in a long brown coat was kneeling beside an overturned box of pocket watches. He had white hair that stuck out in worried tufts and eyebrows that seemed to be trying to escape his face. A pair of magnifying spectacles sat crookedly on his nose. He looked up. "Oh," he said. "Visitor." Walter raised a hand. "Evening." "Is it?" The man looked around wildly. "Is it evening? Are we certain? It was nearly dawn a moment ago, or yesterday afternoon, unless that was next week." Walter considered this carefully. "It feels evening-ish." "Good enough," said the man. "I'll write that down if I can find the correct pencil." He searched his pockets and removed a teaspoon, a brass cog, a folded leaf, and half a biscuit. No pencil. He frowned at the biscuit. "That's not a pencil." "Usually isn't," Walter said. The man stared at him. Then he laughed, very softly, as if laughter were an old machine he had nearly forgotten how to operate. "I'm the clockmaker," he said. Walter waited. The man looked uncertain. "At least I think I am." "You don't know?" "I know what I do. I mend the garden's time. I wind the hours, prune the minutes, plant the seconds, thin the overgrown afternoons. But my name," he tapped his forehead. "Mislaid. Slipped between things, perhaps." Walter looked around the clearing. "Things seem a little muddled." The clockmaker's face fell. "Muddled is generous. The garden is losing its rhythm. Minutes are escaping. Hours are ripening in the wrong order. Yesterday bloomed in the orchard this morning. Tomorrow has gone missing entirely." Missing tomorrow sounds inconvenient. Deeply. The clockmaker picked up a pocket watch and held it to his ear. It made no sound. He shook it. A small blue petal fell out. "Worse than I thought." Walter stepped closer to the workbench. "What caused it?" The clockmaker looked toward the distant glasshouse. "The master clock has stopped keeping the garden together. Everything grows from its rhythm. Every flower, every path, every remembered hour. If it fails completely, the garden will scatter." "Scatter where?" "Into forgetfulness." The word settled heavily between them. Walter touched the notebook in his pocket again. The clockmaker noticed. "You brought a book." "A notebook." "Good. Notes are useful. Names hide in them sometimes. So do answers." Walter took it out. The leather cover seemed warmer than before. He opened it to the page he'd seen at home. His wife's handwriting lay there in the moonlight. "Time is not a road we walk. It is a garden we misplace ourselves in." The clockmaker leaned closer. His expression changed. For a moment his face softened with recognition, though not of Walter. "Who wrote that?" "My wife." "A librarian?" Walter looked at him sharply. "Yes." The clockmaker nodded slowly. "Librarians know the side doors." Walter waited for him to explain. He did not. Walter had noticed that magical places often made remarks as though that were sufficient. A sudden gust blew through the clearing. The flowers shivered. The silver minutes rose from the path in a frightened cloud. Then, somewhere in the distance, a bell struck. Once, twice, then half a chime, then a strange hollow note that seemed to bend in the air. The clockmaker went pale. "The lost minutes are gathering." "Is that bad?" "It depends where they gather. If they gather at the fountain, confusing. If they gather in the orchard, inconvenient. If they gather at the master clock—" He swallowed. "Then the garden forgets what comes next." Walter looked toward the glowing glasshouse. The clock above its door was still turning backwards. "Then I suppose," he said, closing his notebook, "we'd better go and find out what next comes." The clockmaker blinked. "You'll help?" Walter adjusted his scarf. "I've already fallen out of a library chair into a garden full of clocks. Seems wasteful not to." The clockmaker smiled, a small smile, but a real one. He gathered a lantern from the bench. It was made of brass and glass, and instead of a flame, it held a tiny turning moon. Walter looked at it approvingly. "Handy moon, that." "Yes," said the clockmaker, "but it only shines on what has been forgotten. Useful and judgmental. A little." Together they stepped onto the path. Ahead, the garden opened into darkness and gold. Flowers ticked. Leaves turned. Silver minutes drifted over the stones. And far away, inside the glowing glass house, something enormous gave a slow, broken beat. Not quite a tick. Not quite a heart. Walter followed the sound, his notebook warm in his pocket, and wondered what sort of garden needed saving from time itself. Behind him on the workbench, the silent pocket watch began to move. One hand twitched, then stopped, then pointed very slowly toward dawn. Chapter 2. The Orchard of Forgotten Hours. Walter Bramble had never walked through a garden where the flowers argued with time before. As new experiences went, it was a fairly unusual one. The clockmaker carried his curious lantern ahead of him, while Walter followed along a winding path of pale stone. The lantern's tiny moon rotated slowly inside its glass chamber, casting silver light across the flower beds. Every now and then the moonlight revealed something hidden. A pathway would appear where none had existed moments earlier. A gate would emerge from a hedge. A forgotten bench would materialize beneath a tree. "Handy thing, that lantern." The clockmaker nodded. "It only shows forgotten things. Useful for finding spectacles. It once found an entire Tuesday." Walter considered this. Where had Tuesday gone? No one ever discovered. The clockmaker seemed entirely serious. Walter decided not to pursue the matter. The path curved between towering flower beds. Here the flowers had become stranger. Some blooms opened to reveal tiny clock faces inside. Others carried spinning brass hands instead of petals. One enormous sunflower turned slowly as they passed, following them with the solemn attention of a lighthouse keeper. Walter gave it a polite nod. The sunflower appeared pleased. Ahead, the garden gradually changed. The flower beds became fewer, the trees became larger. Golden light shimmered among their branches. The air itself seemed different here. Warmer, softer, filled with distant whispers. The clockmaker stopped. His expression darkened. "We've arrived." Before them stood an orchard unlike any Walter had ever seen. Hundreds of trees stretched into the distance, but instead of fruit, each branch carried glowing glass lanterns. Thousands of them, some blue, some gold, some silver, some no larger than a walnut, others the size of pumpkins. Every lantern glowed with a different light, and every lantern contained a memory. Walter somehow knew this immediately. The knowledge arrived in his mind as naturally as recognizing sunlight. "What is this place?" "The Orchard of Forgotten Hours." The clockmaker lowered his voice. "Memories that people no longer visit eventually find their way here." Walter stared at the lanterns. They swayed gently overhead. Soft images flickered within them. A child riding a bicycle. A seaside holiday. Someone laughing around a dinner table. A dog racing across a field. Countless small moments. Ordinary moments. The sort that quietly build a life. Walter felt unexpectedly moved. Seems a shame to forget them. The clockmaker nodded. Most aren't truly forgotten, only misplaced. Walter smiled. "Like your name." "Exactly." They walked deeper into the orchard. As they passed beneath the branches, Walter could hear fragments of distant sounds, Laughter, music, rain, footsteps, voices. Not enough to understand, only enough to recognize, like hearing a familiar song from another room. The lantern moon suddenly brightened. The clockmaker stopped. It sees something. Ahead stood a tree, larger than all the others, its trunk twisted upward like braided rope. Unlike the surrounding trees, many of its lanterns were dark. Dozens hung unlit among the branches. The sight made Walter uneasy. What's wrong with them? The clockmaker looked worried. Their hours are disappearing. Disappearing where? The clockmaker glanced toward the distant glass house. Walter noticed he kept doing that. Always the glass house, always the backwards clock. Something is drawing them away. They approached the tree. One lantern swung low enough for Walter to touch. Inside, a faint image flickered. A little girl blowing out birthday candles. The picture flashed, dimmed, nearly vanished, then returned. Walter frowned. The memory seemed to be struggling, as though it were being erased. The clockmaker opened a small brass case and removed several tools, tiny screwdrivers, miniature keys, a watchmaker's loop. He examined the lantern. Finally, he sighed. Time is leaking. Can it be repaired? Usually. The clockmaker's expression became troubled. Not this time. Walter looked around. Hundreds of lanterns glowed overhead, yet many appeared weaker than before. Something was definitely wrong. A sudden gust moved through the orchard. Lanterns swayed. Their lights flickered. Then Walter noticed something strange. Small silver shapes were moving among the branches. The lost minutes, hundreds of them, thousands perhaps. The same delicate paper-like creatures he had seen earlier. But now they seemed agitated, restless, circling the trees in great silent clouds. The clockmaker's face went pale. They shouldn't be here. The silver minutes spiraled around the orchard. Walter watched one land upon a lantern. Immediately the lantern brightened. The memory inside grew clearer. Then the minute lifted away. The lantern dimmed again. Walter blinked. Hold on. The clockmaker looked at him. What? The minutes are feeding them. What? Walter pointed upward. Look. The clockmaker watched. A second lost minute settled on another lantern. The same thing happened. Light strengthened, memory sharpened, then faded again when the minute departed. The clockmaker stared. I've never noticed that. Walter smiled slightly. Sometimes looking isn't the same as seeing. The clockmaker looked impressed. I should write that down. If you can find a pencil. The clockmaker laughed. For a moment, the tension eased. Then a louder sound echoed through the orchard. A bell. Not the distant broken bell from before. A deep bell, heavy, ancient. It rang once. The entire orchard trembled. Lanterns swung violently. Several darkened completely. The lost minutes scattered in alarm. The clockmaker grabbed Walter's arm. We must hurry. Hurry where? The keeper's house. What keeper? The keeper of memories. Walter looked around. I wasn't aware we had one. Neither was I until recently. The clockmaker sounded annoyed. As developments go, it has been most inconvenient. They hurried deeper into the orchard. The paths became narrower. Trees crowded together overhead. The lanterns grew larger. Some now hung only inches above their heads. Walter caught glimpses of countless lives: a wedding, a fishing trip, a snowy Christmas, a child reading beneath blankets with a torch, a young woman dancing alone in a kitchen. Small moments, yet somehow precious. The sort of memories nobody planned to remember forever, yet did. The path finally opened into a clearing. At its centre stood a small cottage, or perhaps a very large birdhouse. Walter could not quite decide. The building appeared assembled from clocks, walls of clock faces, roof tiles shaped like pocket watches, windows framed with brass gears. Even the chimney seemed constructed from stacked sundials. Interesting architecture. "He's eccentric," says the man who prunes afternoons. Fair point. They approached the door. Before either could knock, it swung open. An elderly woman stood inside. She wore a patchwork coat covered in embroidered clocks. Tiny silver spectacles perched on her nose. Her hair resembled a particularly organized cloud. She looked directly at Walter. Not surprised, not alarmed, simply expectant. "Oh, good." She stepped aside. "You're late." Walter blinked. "I am." "Not you personally." She pointed at the clockmaker. "Him." The clockmaker sighed. "Everyone says that." The woman waved them inside. The cottage contained more clocks than Walter had believed possible. Every wall ticked, every shelf ticked. Even the teapot appeared to tick. Somehow it was not unpleasant, merely determined. The woman poured tea. "You're looking for the missing hours." Walter sat down. "We are. They're being taken." "By whom?" The woman became serious. "The master clock is failing." Walter exchanged a glance with the clockmaker. Again the master clock. Again the glass house. The woman continued. "For centuries, the master clock kept every memory, minute and hour, in harmony." She pointed toward the window. "Now it has begun forgetting." Walter frowned. "A clock can forget. Anything can forget." The woman looked at him carefully. "Even gardens." Walter considered that. It sounded exactly like the sort of thing magical gardens would do. The woman leaned forward. "The problem began when something was removed." "Removed?" She nodded. "A memory." Walter felt a chill. "What sort of memory?" The woman looked directly at the notebook in his pocket. "The sort people refuse to let disappear." Slowly, Walter removed the notebook. The leather cover seemed warmer than ever. He opened it. A folded page slipped free. Walter frowned. He had never seen it before. Carefully, he unfolded it. The paper contained his wife's handwriting, not a quotation, a note, just a few lines. Walter read them silently, then again. His throat tightened. The note simply said, "If you ever find yourself lost in a garden of time, remember that some things are worth preserving, not because they are important, but because they are loved." For a long moment, nobody spoke. The clockmaker looked at the note. The woman smiled softly. "I thought that might help." Walter stared. "You know her?" The woman shook her head. "No." Then she smiled mysteriously. "But the library does." Before Walter could ask what that meant, another bell rang, louder this time, much louder. The clocks throughout the cottage shuddered. Several stopped entirely. Silence spread through the room. The woman stood. Her expression had changed. It has begun. What has? The woman pointed through the window, far beyond the orchard, beyond the trees, beyond the flower beds. The glass house glowed brighter than before. The backwards turning clock above its door had almost stopped. Its hands now moved in tiny jerks. The clockmaker looked horrified. "The master clock is dying." Walter closed the notebook. His wife's words lingered in his thoughts, not because they are important, because they are loved. He stood. "Then we'd better get moving." The clockmaker nodded. The woman handed Walter a small brass key. It was surprisingly heavy. "What does this open?" "The last door." Walter looked at the key, then at the distant glass house, then back at the woman. "The last door where?" She smiled. "The place you're going next." Outside, the orchard lanterns swayed in the gathering wind. The lost minutes rose into the sky like silver birds, and far away, deep within the glowing glass house, something enormous gave one final broken tick, then fell silent. The master clock had stopped, and for the first time the garden no longer knew what time it was. Chapter 3. The Last Clock at Dawn. The garden had gone quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Wrong quiet. The sort of quiet that makes you stop halfway through a sentence because something doesn't feel where it ought to be. Walter Bramble noticed it immediately. The flowers no longer ticked. The lanterns in the orchard of forgotten hours no longer swayed. Even the breeze seemed uncertain about what direction it should be travelling. Ahead of them, beyond the darkened orchard, the great glass house stood beneath the stars. The clock above its entrance had finally stopped. Its hands pointed nowhere useful. The clockmaker stared at it. For the first time since Walter had met him, the old man looked genuinely afraid. "We're too late." Walter slipped the brass key into his pocket. "Possibly." The clockmaker looked surprised. "That's not very encouraging." "No." Walter adjusted his scarf. "But it's honest." They began walking. The path wound through the sleeping garden. Around them stood silent roses made of brass and velvet. Clockwork daisies sat frozen in place. Silver minutes drifted through the darkness like lost snowflakes. Without the master clock, the whole garden seemed to be holding its breath. The glass house grew larger. Its curved roof gleamed beneath the stars. Walter could now see countless gears turning slowly inside the walls. Some moved forwards, others backwards. A few appeared undecided. "Garden's having a difficult evening." "It is." The clockmaker sighed. "It was beautiful once." Walter looked around. "It still is." The old man smiled sadly. "That's kind." They reached the entrance. A pair of enormous brass doors stood before them. No handle, no keyhole, nothing. The clockmaker frowned. "That's unfortunate." Walter reached into his pocket. The brass key felt warm, very warm, almost hot. Slowly he removed it. The key immediately began glowing. Golden light spread across its surface. Somewhere inside the door, machinery stirred. The clockmaker blinked. "Well?" Walter examined the key. "Seems enthusiastic." The great doors slowly opened. Warm amber light spilled outward. Beyond lay the heart of the garden. Walter stepped inside, then stopped. For a moment he simply stared. The interior of the glasshouse was vast, far larger than should have been possible. Glass arches rose high overhead like the roof of a cathedral. Thousands of gears turned within the walls. Countless clocks hung suspended in mid-air, pocket watches, grandfather clocks, sundials, hourglasses, cuckoo clocks, every kind of clock imaginable, all frozen, all silent. At the center stood the master clock. It towered above everything else, 30 feet high at least, perhaps more. Its face glowed softly beneath layers of glass and brass. Golden vines climbed around its frame. Flowers bloomed from its gears. Yet it had stopped. The great hands rested motionless. The silence felt enormous. Walter approached slowly. The notebook in his pocket seemed heavier than usual. The clockmaker removed his spectacles. "Oh, dear." Walter looked up. One section of the master clock stood open. Inside should have been a central mechanism. Instead, there was an empty space. A hollow. Something was missing. The clockmaker whispered, "The memory spring." "The what?" "The part that keeps the garden remembering itself." Walter frowned. "Someone stole it?" "No." The clockmaker looked confused. "It cannot be stolen." "Why not?" "Because it isn't an object." Walter waited. The old man pointed toward the empty space. "The memory spring is a memory." Walter blinked. "A memory. An important one." "Whose?" The clockmaker looked away. "I don't know." At that moment a voice echoed through the glass house, soft, gentle, familiar. "Perhaps you do." Walter froze. The voice had not come from the clockmaker, nor from the garden. It had come from the notebook. Slowly he removed it. The leather cover glowed faintly. The pages began turning by themselves, one after another, dozens of them, sketches, notes, observations, quotations. Then the pages stopped. A photograph slipped free. Walter caught it before it reached the floor. His breath caught. It was a photograph of his wife, much younger, standing outside the library, smiling. On the back she had written, "Some memories keep places alive." Walter stared at the words. Then something clicked. Not in the garden. Inside his own thoughts. The library, the notebook, the quotations, the strange familiarity everyone seemed to have with his wife, even the mysterious woman in the cottage. Walter looked at the clockmaker. "You knew her?" The old man blinked. "What?" "You knew my wife." "I've never met your wife." But as he spoke, uncertainty crossed his face. The expression of someone standing on the edge of remembering. Walter held out the photograph. The clockmaker looked at it. And suddenly everything changed. The air shimmered. The glass house brightened. The old man's eyes widened. "Oh!" He took a step backwards, then another. "I remember." The words emerged as a whisper. The clockmaker placed a trembling hand against the master clock. Memories flooded across the glass. Images appeared everywhere. Walter's wife visiting the library, reading, writing, smiling, laughing, talking with Mrs. Finch, making notes in the notebook. The clockmaker watched them unfold. "I remember." His voice cracked. "Years ago she came here." Walter stared. "Here?" The old man nodded. "Many times." The memory continued growing. Walter's wife sitting beside the master clock, writing quotations into her notebook, talking with the clockmaker, helping him catalogue forgotten hours, helping him organize memories, helping him preserve stories. The old man smiled through tears. She was one of the keepers. Walter felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. Not sadness, not exactly. Something gentler, something brighter. The clockmaker looked at the empty space within the master clock. Then he finally understood. The memory spring. Walter looked at him. What is it? The old man smiled. It isn't a memory of an event. He turned toward Walter. It's a memory of being loved. The words echoed through the glass house. Instantly everything became still. The notebook glowed brighter, pages turned again, then stopped at a quotation Walter had seen countless times but never truly noticed. Written in his wife's hand, "What we love remains with us, not behind us, with us." The entire glass house filled with golden light. The missing space within the master clock began glowing. Walter watched in amazement. The warmth from the notebook flowed into the clock, not the notebook itself, the memories inside it. The years of observations, sketches, shared jokes, favorite quotations, small moments, ordinary moments. The very things the orchard had been protecting all along. The missing memory spring began to reform. A spiral of golden light appeared within the hollow. Slowly it took shape, a spring made entirely of memories. The master clock shuddered, a single gear turned. Then another, then another. The sound echoed through the garden. A tick, the first tick, the first in many years. The clockmaker laughed, then cried, then laughed again. That's better. The second tick followed, then a third, then dozens, hundreds, thousands. Every clock within the glass house came alive. Outside, the garden responded immediately. The flowers began moving again. The lanterns relit. The lost minutes swirled joyfully through the air. Far away, the orchard glowed brighter than ever. The great hands of the master clock slowly advanced. Forward this time. As they moved, dawn began appearing beyond the glass roof. The stars faded. Soft gold light touched the horizon. The clockmaker watched the sunrise. I remember my name, Walter smiled. I was wondering about that. The old man laughed. Alaric, pleasure to meet you properly. And you, Walter Bramble. For a while they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the garden awaken, watching time settle back into place, watching dawn arrive exactly when dawn ought to arrive. Eventually the notebook grew warm again. Walter looked down. A familiar sign. The journey home was approaching. The clockmaker saw it too. Time to go. Walter nodded. Seems so. The old man extended his hand. Walter shook it. Thank you. What for? For remembering. The garden brightened. The glass house faded. The sound of ticking became distant, then distant still. And finally, Walter found himself sitting in a chair at the library. The green book lay open before him. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows. Everything looked perfectly ordinary. Mrs. Finch stood nearby holding a stack of books. She glanced up. There you are, Walter blinked. There I am. Find a good one? Walter looked at the green book. The title now gleamed clearly on the cover, The Clockmaker's Garden. Very good, Mrs. Finch smiled. I thought you might like that one. Walter stood. Something occurred to him. Mrs. Finch? Yes? Did my wife ever mention a clockmaker called Alaric? Mrs. Finch's smile deepened. Only slightly. Just enough. Occasionally, Walter waited. Mrs. Finch returned to shelving books. Clearly, that was all he was getting. Some mysteries, Walter reflected, preferred remaining comfortable. He carried the book back to the desk. Outside, morning sunlight filled the street. The world continued exactly as it always had, and yet not quite. When Walter reached home, he sat at the kitchen table and opened the notebook. On the final blank page he wrote, "Visited a garden where clocks grew among the flowers. Met a clockmaker who had misplaced his name. Learned that memory is not the same thing as importance. Some things survive because they are loved." He paused, then added, "Also saw a sunflower that appeared unusually pleased with itself." Walter closed the notebook. The house ticked softly around him. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck the hour. Outside, the blackbird resumed its daily complaints. Walter smiled. "Good morning to you, too." And somewhere far beyond ordinary maps, the clockmaker's garden continued to bloom. Its flowers opened, its clocks turned, its lanterns glowed, and among its pathways every lost minute eventually found its way home. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining Walter Bramble on another adventure. If you enjoyed this story and would like to accompany Walter on future journeys into forgotten worlds, mysterious books, and curious places, please consider subscribing. Until next time, good night and sleep well.